let me invite our second speaker, Mr. Harris Liu, who's the Chief Representative in India for the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade, CCPIT. My question to you, sir, is what are the challenges in trade and investment between India and China that have emerged in light of this recent development amidst the ongoing pandemic?
Thank you, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm of the opinion that one of the motivations behind the government's change of the rules is to control, manage, and regulate investment from China in different sectors. Sectors of strategy are not allowed to be invested by China. Some non-sensitive sectors, through procedures approval, are allowed to invest. Indian government has said electrical, pharmaceutical, medical equipment, electronics act as the key sectors to promote development of manufacturing industry. After getting the approval, Chinese companies should be able to invest also in sectors of automobiles and renewable energy. In a word, investment from China must submit application in advance and waiting for approval. There's no doubt that the increase of initial input, time, cost, and uncertainty will bring challenges to the trade and investment cooperation between China and India in the days to come. And at the same time, China welcomes Indian investment in China in all sectors except those specified in the negative list. The Chinese government at all levels has given full support and always will. I firmly believe that China welcomes foreign investment, including from India, and there will be no change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liu. I'll now invite our third speaker, Ms. Pratibha Jain, who's a partner at Nishith, Desai Associates, is head of the firm's New Delhi office. Given what Dr. Kumar and Mr. Liu just said, I'll add that we desperately need VIP, vaccine, investment, and predictability on both the first. So Pratibha, my question is, what are the major legal implications for India of adopting this kind of a protectionist approach towards valuable FDI?
So Ashish, let me not question India's decision making with respect to getting or protecting itself in terms of national security issues and creating laws in that regard, and their decision to consider Chinese investments from a national security perspective. Having said that, I think the way the law was introduced, it's too overarching. Currently, there's no definition. So it's not just that they're curbing investments from China and other neighboring countries. They've said, the words they've used is any investment where there is beneficial ownership from a Chinese citizen or an entity based in China. That has to go for approval route. Now, it's very difficult to ascertain what they mean by beneficial ownership without having defined it. Because even if you own one share indirectly, you could have beneficial ownership from China. And today, the way, with full respect to Dr. Mohan Kumar, we live in a globalized world where the financial investors are, the biggest investors are global investors who have investments pooled from various jurisdictions, including China, and are investing globally, including India. And that's the investment we want. That's not an investment we want to curb. But unfortunately, the wording is so broad that, big private equity investors such as KKR or Warburg Pincus, who have billions of dollars and have been and want to invest in India, might now have to go for approval route unless there is some clarification in this regard. Also, just purely from a business perspective, I do believe not just India, but world over, I think there is a knee-jerk reaction to the COVID-19 situation. I think globalization is not something that can be undone, just based on one pandemic. Like I said, there is a new beast in the world, which are the global financial investors, and that is not being undone anytime soon, and that is exactly who we are targeting for India's growth. I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you, Pratibha. I'll now invite our fourth speaker, who's an entrepreneur, a former executive director of Tata Sons, and a respected commentator based in Hong Kong, Mr. Alan Rosling. Alan, do you think these developments would reduce the enthusiasm of Chinese investors towards India, many of which are present in this meeting?
Thanks, Prof. And very nice to join you this afternoon. Yes, of course it will. What investors need is certainty. Investors need a lack of political risk and a reduction in all the things which might impact their investments adversely. So the very fact you now have to go to the undefined new equivalent of what used to be called the Foreign Investment Prevention Board, among those of us trying to do FDI into India, the FIPB or its subsequent successor bodies, proves, very few Chinese investors will contemplate that with excitement and interest. I think it's just crazy. So I'm a Hong Kong resident. I will now have to apply for this clearance through whatever system it is to invest in my Bombay-based business where I'm a joint venture partner. So already we have an extraordinarily modest relationship between India and China economically, both in terms of trade. It's only $93 billion, skewed heavily, of course, in China's favor. And also FDI is remarkably small. So maybe something like $9 billion of Chinese investment into India cumulatively, which is, almost what Mukesh Bai has raised for his one business in the last month, one business from about 5 investors. So it's very small. Chinese, as a guy who used to develop Indian investment into China, I know what Harish Ji said in terms of China welcoming Indian investment is not always true. We as Tatas were banned from investment in telecom, steel, automotive, and so on. So China is not the most easy place for Indian investors, but India has just made it much worse for Chinese investors. I have to say, I believe that the smaller and newer businesses, the VC-backed and new growth tech businesses, has been one of the bright spots of India-China relations, particularly thanks to Alibaba's path-breaking investment into Paytm. Subsequently, we've had something like $5 or $6 billion of Chinese investment into Indian tech. That can only be for the Indian consumers' benefit. That now has to go through the government of India for approval case by case. So I think the answer to your question is yes, and I regret it deeply. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Let me invite our fifth speaker, who's very well positioned on the supply side of Chinese investments in India, Mr. Zheng Bin. Mr. Bin is CEO of the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, Mumbai branch. And my question to you, sir, is how will these safeguards against foreign investments influence the existing operations of Chinese banks and investors in India?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join today's discussion. I would say this impact is huge and is very negative. This will lead to a lose-lose situation between China and India. None of us will benefit from this policy. So the point here I want to put forward first is really, as you mentioned, it's a safeguard against the foreign investment, or it's only against Chinese investors? This is a very important question. So I think the panelists, some of the panelists have already speak about it and give me the impression is that most of us has agreed that it's only about China. Because if you look at land-bought neighboring countries, China is the only one who can make investment into India. So then the message conveyed through to the Chinese side is that, Chinese investors is that Chinese investors is at least not welcomed for the time being into India. So certainly Chinese companies who has already been established in India or who are planning their new investment into India, we need to reconsider, at least in near future, whether they should continue or they need to change their plans. And one more point I want to say here is that Chinese investment into Indian, market is not because of COVID. So those who have invested, who are planning making investment, it's just looking at its market. And most of them are greenfield projects, which will bring in a lot of employment to the market. So I think this policy is so far, which is not persuasive at all to me. Yeah, I will stop here. So
Thank you very much, Mr. Bin. I'm pleased to invite our sixth and last expert panelist, who's well positioned on the demand side of valuable foreign investments in India. Mr. Tushar Aggarwal, he's founder and CEO of an Indian fintech startup called StashFin. He's previously worked at Everstone Capital and General Atlantic. Tushar, how's the Indian startup sector dealing with this?
Thanks, Ashish, for inviting me. I'll echo my fellow panelists' comments. I think India will have to strike its own balance between globalization and protectionism. Businesses, unlike government policies, require some planning. People, it is human beings and not just a dollar flows between two countries. When rules like this come up, it impacts human beings, it impacts jobs, it impacts business plans, it impacts many, many cases where it may actually hurt India. So I do feel that the rules which have come up, which are unclear, as Pratibha mentioned, will put a great pause between fund flows between the two countries. And I personally believe that India is at a crossroads to take advantage of some geopolitical alignments between perhaps the US and China. And it will be a lost opportunity for us all if we kind of just lose it away by making policy decisions which will hurt India in the long term. As a fellow private equity investor with some of the panelists, the view I share is that a number of sectors already were restricted, and therefore we are almost going back in time by reintroducing these rules by going to go to FIPB for approval, which, as Pratibha mentioned, are not clear to begin with on how to apply for approval and who constitutes someone who has to go for approval or not. So I do think that these measures will take us back in time if they're not clarified very soon.
Thank you, Tushar. So we finished the first segment of our session with initial remarks. You heard what each of our experts had to say. I'll circle back to our first speaker, Dr. Mohan Kumar. Dr. Kumar, India refused to sign the RCEP Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership last year. Now the press note to protect Indian companies or to safeguard their interests. Does this sound like the license Raj or the infant industry argument all over again that people heard in the 70s and 80s?
So Ashish, thank you. Just by way of a joke, I also seem to be in a minority of one, but that's fine. Indian bureaucrats and ex-diplomats are used to be eklo chalo, so that's fine. I have no problem with that. And I appreciate the comments of everyone. I think they have to be taken seriously. Let me just put 2 or 3 things in context. With regard to China, our trade and investment relationship, frankly, it smacks of really being a colonial kind of relationship. All our exports are cotton, tea, coffee, leather, okay, and copper. So this is your bulk of exports. Your imports are all capital equipment, electrical machinery, steel, etc., which of course our companies need. I don't deny that. Nevertheless, you will appreciate India, which has not got a competitive manufacturing industry, cannot keep on sustaining the $60 billion deficit year after year. There needs to be a fix to this. Now, why is it we are not able to export pharmaceutical products to China in great quantities? Why aren't we able to export buffalo meat? Why aren't we able to export ICT? These are areas in which India is a leader, but basically we can't export for a variety of non-tariff barriers and so on. That's one. The second thing is, if you take telecom equipment and if you take semiconductor devices, just to put it in perspective, China accounts for 73% of telecom equipment in India, 82% of semiconductor devices in India, 80% of antibiotics in India come from China, and 75% of active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. This is the kind of dominance that you see. If you take data, everybody is used to saying data is the new oil. So where is the data coming from? Paytm data, Zomato data, there is Swiggy data, there is data coming in from even your browsers like UBC. So data today is completely with the Chinese, whether you like it or not. I mean, it is amazing to me that Indians have a problem with Arogya Setu, but do not have a problem with foreign countries having data, whether it is GAFA or China. And by the way, I don't make a distinction between Google, Amazon, and China. The question here is, who owns data for tomorrow? And if I can do data through TikTok, through Swiggy, through Zomato, through a variety of things, and I'm not even mentioning, you know, the kind of apps and so on, that so there is a concern that data needs to be regulated. So you have to understand from where government of India is coming. So I just wanted to react to the points made by others. It is not a ban on investment. We love SAMI investment in India, which is for making heavy construction cranes. The takeover of a Shanghai-based pharmaceutical Gland Pharma in Hyderabad, good thing. So some investments are very desirable, and it's this old debate between computer chips and potato chips. What is it that the country wants? The country wants computer chips, not potato chips, let's be honest. So that's the first point I will make. The second point on RCEP. RCEP was turned down by India for three reasons. One, there was clearly a China factor. There was clearly, the second issue was actually the non-tariff barriers of ASEAN and China with regard to pharmaceutical products, vegetables, fruits, etc. And thirdly, there were domestic lobbies in India also at work. I readily concede that. Domestic companies in India do not want to face competition in the private sector. Let's be honest about it. So a combination of reasons led us to say no to RCEP. I would finish off this segment, not to take too much time, but I'm happy to come in whenever you want me to come in, because I need to defend the views that I am making. And I'm not saying I'm right and they are wrong. What the others are saying is correct, but I think they are missing the wood for the trees, frankly. Because if data is the new oil, India is going to protect data. Trade and investment is going to become strategic. The era of MFN-based, WTO-based trade and investment is over. That is not going to happen anymore. Every country is going to have a preferential arrangement. So China and India, the relationship is extraordinarily complex. You cannot separate the trade and investment and then separate what is happening in the border, what is happening vis-a-vis Pakistan, what is happening vis-a-vis other countries. I'm putting it as bluntly as I can, because it is naive to think that you are doing a business and all you are interested in is unimpeded investment from China. Not going to happen. But I'm happy to continue this debate. I listen very seriously to what others are saying, and they have good points to make. Thank you, Ashish.
So thanks, Dr. Kumar. So you don't think this is akin to going back to where we were in the 70s or 80s?
I certainly don't think so. But the era of unbridled globalization and free trade is over. That's all I'm saying.
All right. Thank you. Thanks. Mr. Liu, we heard what Dr. Kumar had to say. So he thinks all nations will have some kind of preferential treatment in place. India needs some kind of investments. We don't necessarily look for certain other kinds of investments. What's your response to that?
Oh, yes. I think Mr. Mohan, I think his opinion, his point of view is that politics is playing important role in economic trade relationship. What I'm thinking is that the cooperation and development are the mainstream for countries in the world. The economic and trade and the investment relation between China and India anywhere will still going on. And his opinion about the free trade is over, globalization is over, to some extent because of COVID, of the COVID of this year, really bring about this trend and point of view. To some extent, it is reasonable, but for the long run, I think the globalization, free trade will play important role in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Alan,
by word, I just one word. Thank you.
Sure.
And India will not participate in RCEP. I think that will be not conducive to investment from foreign countries, because they are going to set up factories to make local production in India, and they are going to export, and they're going to take advantage of the RCEP, for example, for agreement trade, for the preferential taxation, something like that. So you see, if you're not going to participate in RCEP, that will bring a negative effect on foreign investment from foreign countries to India. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Alan, when I heard our two experts say what they said, it reminded me of the English philosopher Chesterton, who said, "Do not remove a fence until you know why it was put up in the first place." It's a good way to look at reforms and to understand the second-order effects of an action. Do you think India is steering down enablers of globalization in this day and age? Dr. Kumar talked about data being the new oil and how China is positioned there. Slightly different from the entire discussion on FDI. But do you think India is tearing down these enablers of globalization without really understanding why they were brought about in the first place?
Ashish, frankly, no. I mean, first of all, I think fences and walls are something we've seen a little bit too much of in the world in the last 4 or 5 years. We wanted to pull down the Berlin walls of the world and the economies rather than put up new ones. But I think we've got enough experience in India of what happens when you put walls up. I still am seared by my lunch at Hindustan Motors in about 1979, when they told me that Hindustan Motors would always have a future in India because it was appropriate for India. The car would be, perfect for any conditions. You get the whole family, including Granny and the chickens and everything else in, fix it all over the country. Look what happens when you allow the Japanese in to invest into automotive in India. Hindustan Motors doesn't make cars anymore, but there are millions of cars made in India and they're exported and they create jobs. I do accept Mohanji's point that it should be in India's interest. So what is in India's interest? The first thing I would say is often interests are mutual, particularly in business. The second thing is India needs jobs, because we're going to have, as everyone says, 1 million young people every month coming onto the job market. To do that, we need investment. We particularly need investment in infrastructure. We need technology, and we need exports. And there are reasons why the Chinese don't buy our goods. Frankly, often we are uncompetitive. And the CII has done quite a lot of work in as to why India is uncompetitive in various sectors. There are reasons for it, which again, sometimes come back to government policies. So I think if India's interest is in investment, job creations, and so on, I have no problem with potato chips. If you think of Pepsi, who was one of the first foreigners to be allowed back into the country, what did they do? They invested in potato chips. And they created a supply chain back to Indian farmers because they had to grow potatoes, which produced massive wealth, particularly in the Punjab, and throughout the supply chain, and all the way now through into modern retailing. So Pepsi was the guy who started with potato chips and have created literally millions of jobs in India, maybe not high quality tech jobs very often, but jobs nonetheless. So except in very few technology sectors, and having worked for a prime minister myself, frankly, I'm not convinced that most the arguments around national security hold water, but that's for the government to decide. Apart from national security issues, I think there are very few cases when a government should have a problem with investment. And the experience of the last 40 years is one thing Indian businessmen are very good at is special pleading in Delhi. I mean, I just point to the retail sector, where apparently shops are strategic and of national importance because foreigners are not allowed to go into retail, for the logic which is obviously very clear to everyone on the call. It's around national security as to why foreigners cannot run a shop in India.
Thank you, Alan. That was quite insightful. Pratibha, I want to come to you now. Now, apart from national security issues and some sort of pandemic politics playing out, I want to touch on a specific issue within this entire topic. Now, given that Chinese FDI will now be subject to screening, not just in India, but in several countries, I feel there is a key difference. The Western countries, including those who have initiated similar actions in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, they've used special laws for screening FDI to curb any kind of opportunistic takeover. However, India is using its, perhaps its exchange control law to do this for this purpose. Now, do you think that FEMA, the Foreign Exchange Management Act, is the right way to tackle national security? For our participants, FEMA is the Foreign Exchange Management Act enacted in 1999. It's also called as the Exchange Control Law. Pratibha.
So that's a very good question, Ashish. Ideally, no. The foreign exchange regulations should limit itself to the purpose it was set up for, which is we have a restriction on capital account convertibility, and we should and we have decided that from a financial perspective, inflow and outflow of capital is something that is going to be monitored by the central bank, and the policy is going to be made in Delhi. So that should be purely financial in nature. And in fact, the government had been considering a law similar to what we have in the US, the CFIUS, which would strategically look at national interests. But I think, unfortunately, because of the pandemic and certain investments that came into the country during that time, everybody got spooked, and something needed to be done quickly, and this was unfortunately a quick fix. So I totally agree on the issue on, India does need to think about its national security, but how we implement these laws I think every time we make a law, we need to think of what its impact is going to be on our economic development, on our the plan that the Prime Minister had of India becoming a $5 trillion economy. Unfortunately, every time something geopolitical, national security, data privacy, all these issues somehow get tied up with getting foreign investment into the country. And that is very unfortunate. Even on Dr. Mohan Kumar's point on data privacy, that should be dealt with the data privacy law. That should not be dealt through curbs on foreign investment. It's very unclear today, the press note that they've come out with, is it a national security issue or is it a financial security issue? Because if it is a national security issue, you would not restrict all investments or send all investments without some amount of threshold of control for approval. Today, control is not there in the definition of beneficial ownership. They basically say if you have any beneficial ownership from any Chinese entity or citizen, then you have to go for approval. Now, that's very overarching, and that's stymied investments into the country. So I think if we start looking at investments separate from, and start dealing with national security, data privacy, all these strategic issues from and we have very strong laws. Our data privacy bill is equivalent to the GDPR in Europe. So quite overarching in terms of protection of data. We have antitrust regulation and regulator, which is very, very, very strong. So we have various other means of controlling, such other issues. And, of course, the trade agreements that we enter into. I think we should just start looking at foreign investment as an engine of growth and take very serious note of any amendments we come out with, because every time we change these regulations, we spook investors. And investors, above everything else, want certainty.
Thank you, Pratibha. I want to come to Mr. Zheng Bin now. We heard what Pratibha just said. Every time something like this is initiated by the government in India, it ends up more often than not spooking investors. And we should start looking at investments and finances separate from national security issues. So with that background, I have a specific question for Mr. Bin. So low valuation typically represents an opportunity for corporate investments, mergers, and restructuring. But exploiting international business opportunities in recession-hit economies, that too in a global pandemic, can be interpreted as an ill-timed move. Now, do you think some companies have taken a road which is paved with good business strategic intentions, but it's leading to a diplomatic and PR crisis?
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, I don't notice any deals done by Chinese investors who's, trying to take advantage of the lower valuation of any Indian companies. As a banker, I'm still hesitate to say that we are already bottoming up globally even. So making an investment now with the current valuation, I don't think it's really a cheap valuation by a financial standard. So even if there's any investment, it would be driven by some business motivations rather than by valuation motivations. I would say I would like to recommend the audience, which is, especially those Chinese audience, that it is not time to make investment if you only look at valuation. It's not the time yet. Apart from there, I really appreciate what Dr. Kumar has mentioned, some of the points, which is very frank. I just want to also say something from my side. One is about data. So I totally agree that data is the future's oil and it's very important. But look at the stake sales to Facebook, and the current discussion of might be another sale to Microsoft. So what is the difference between data in Jio and data, say in Zomato or in Swiggy? While if one of the triggers of this policy is so-called 1% investment into HDFC, so 1% in the HDFC versus 20% in Jio, which is imposing more so-called national security threats to Indian, I'm not convinced here. The other one is investments about potato chips and computer chips. India has to be very honest about our stage of development. So it's like in China. So we cannot be overconfident saying that we want only the computer chips. We don't want potato chips. But now it is not time to see that yet. China is doing this. So if you look at China, when we start up, the opening up, we're taking a lot of FDIs. Whichever the sectors are, we are not picky at that time. I don't think Indian is now in a position that we can be very picky in what the kind of FDI we want to have. So the point that I want to say last is, really it's a political decision or it's an economic motivation behind that. So if it's a political, if you want to mix up or mess up with border issues, with historical issues, then I don't see any solution to that. So usually I like the atmosphere in Mumbai that business is business. We do business here. We do business between Chinese and Indian businessmen. We do it win-win situation. So don't put too much political things about it. Otherwise, frankly speaking, I don't see any solution. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bin. if you don't mind, Tushar, I'll quickly get a comment and reaction from Dr. Mohan Kumar on what is said. Dr. Mohan, can we afford to financially antagonize China? What's your response to what was just discussed?
How frank do you want me to be, Ashish?
As much as possible in a reasonable sense.
Okay, look at this. China does not figure in the top 10 investors in India in the year 2018-19. Okay, I've got the list in front of me. China simply does not figure. So as somebody said earlier on, the Chinese investment is minuscule in India. Second, to what Mr. Zheng has said, I may be mispronouncing his name. Does China allow Amazon, Google, Twitter in China? Please tell me. Do they allow China? Do they allow these to operate in China? No. So it is national security. So don't tell me that all trade and investment must be removed from national security. Not going to happen. I repeat once again, I know people don't want to hear this. The world has changed permanently after COVID. It's going to be geostrategic, whether you like it or not. Third, do I know how to distinguish between a state-owned enterprise and a private sector company in China? I don't. I simply don't. The lines are very, very blurred. I mean, you have people like Jack Ma, you have people who are founders of Xiaomi, you have people who are founders of other companies who are actually sitting on the People's Consultative Assembly and the Chinese Communist Party. So there is a system there where trade is already highly politicized. So I'm not suggesting that India should do the same. I probably think we will not. And I certainly take Pratibha's point with regard to the arbitrariness of this particular order. I'll be the first to say there should be a definition of beneficial ownership and there should be clarity. That criticism, 100% valid. But frankly, Ashish, in today's day and age, if you look at the mobile company market, all your Indian companies have been wiped out. Let's be honest, where is Micromax today? All this is because of Chinese company. You guys have to be blind to realize that, nothing has changed and that we should simply keep allowing foreign direct investment. Not going to work. We've been crying ourselves hoarse that allow us to invest in ICT companies in China, allow us to export pharmaceutical products to China. There is a small manufacturer in Pune who wanted to export something to China. The Chinese said the importer has to make a visit to Pune and the Pune manufacturer has to pay for it. After 6 months, the guy said, I want to come back again. Again, the small company in Pune has to pay for it. Come on. Data is different. I'm not talking of data privacy. I'm talking of monetizing data. India is a country where it has virgin data. Now, I agree with Mr. Zheng that on paper, we should have no difference whether Jio monetizes it, whether Google monetizes it, or whether Alibaba monetizes it. But you ask people, what are the significant differences in which this is monetized? And then you will have geopolitics play a part. It's a decision Indian government and India has to take. That's all I'm saying. But this is where I will stop because I've tried to be as frank as possible because this is an extraordinary complex relationship. Unless you speak frankly among friends, you will never get to the bottom of it. This is one problem I also have with the government and the private sector. They don't speak frankly with each other. That's a problem. So I like that there should be a frank conversation, but I would request Chinese friends also to be honest and frank. It cannot be a one-sided relationship is all I'm saying. Sorry if I took too much time, Ashish.
No, that was quite valuable, and I really appreciate the frankness. I just have one point of disagreement in that mobile phone industry that you talked about. We saw the disruption in Indian market predominantly because of the competition and market forces, how they played out. As Alan said, the parameters we need to focus on: creating jobs, investment in infrastructure, bringing the right technology, and being able to export. A lot of our homegrown manufacturers or players in the mobile phone, smartphone market were unable to do it on each of these parameters. But I agree with the other points. Sorry for keeping you on hold, Tushar. I want to ask a question on, so India's fascination with the ease of doing business and the rankings around it, I mean, they haven't really served us well so far. In fact, Vietnam, which ranks below India, has managed to attract more foreign investments in the recent past. Do you think India is ready for foreign companies that may want to quit China? That's part A of my question. And part B is any response to what was just discussed in the technology space?
I'll answer your second question first. So I think what I agree with Dr. Mohan, and I also agree with some of the panelists, the comments which they made. But I think it's important for us to realize the comment which Zheng made, which is that we need to recognize where we are in our own economic cycle of growth and be very cognizant about how we can take advantage of some of the geopolitical alignments which are happening around the world. India represents 1/3 of humanity, 1/6 the land mass, yet there is no global product which is competitive enough, which India exports for a variety of reasons, could be tariff barriers or other reasons. So I think it's important for us to understand where we are in our sort of cycle of growth. It is also possible, in my view, to have security, diplomacy, political constraints, as well as technology and investments to coexist. A prime example could be perhaps the United States, where even though at least geopolitically they seem to be at loggerheads with each other, but the Chinese are the largest buyers of US treasuries and also one of the largest investors in the United States and vice versa. So I don't think that the answer to this solution is to have all discussion points at all points in time, which is solve the border issues and solve the political issues, the historical trade routes we've had, what's happening with the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan. I think if we were to be tactical and strategic about it, we could be coming out winning from this. India is perhaps the only market left in the global sphere where a lot of our industries are undeveloped. There's investments required in power, infrastructure, automobiles, cell phone networks, roads, bridges, and it represents an attractive investment opportunity for a variety of countries. And I think we should be very tactical about how we can take advantage of that. So that's part B of your question. I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question.
The first part was about you think Indian businesses, Indian companies are ready to attract some of the investments that are flowing out of China, particularly in the startup space.
Yeah, I mean, look, I won't necessarily single out India in terms of where we are, but look, as most of you would know, the macro indicators which make India attractive are very unique to India. We have a population which is relatively young. We have mobile telephony in its infancy, data usage is in its infancy. 300 million people on mobile data. I was meeting someone yesterday. Someone described me that guess which is the most popular channel on YouTube, and it was surprising for me to learn that worldwide, a channel which has almost 200 million views is a Bhojpuri channel. So around the world, there is no one else who's watching and consuming data the way we are for the last several years. So I do think that India represents a very attractive opportunity for global investors and Chinese alike, largely due to the macro nature and the macro factors which make India very attractive.
Thank you very much, Tushar. We have managed to finish the second segment of our session on time. I would like to now bring in the audience in our next segment. We've already received a handful of questions. I want to start with Alan. Alan, there's a question for you from Professor Yongli Jin. He's a law professor at Renmin University of China in Beijing. And his question is, could some of the biggest business conglomerates in India do something to push for a closer and a more meaningful economic relations between the two countries? They are well placed and it's a win-win after all. Alan.
Well, the answer, as ever, these things is in part, partly true. So there are, of course, business conglomerates and business enterprises and undertakings with some influence with the government. But I have to say they are fewer than there were 10 years ago in the previous administration. So probably Modi ji would only listen to a relatively few number of entrepreneurs compared to what Manmohan Singh might have done. So all I can go back to is my own experience of being an international spearhead for the Tata Group. We obviously spent a lot of time with the government of India explaining why their policies should encourage we as Indian industrialists to go abroad. We also spent time with the governments of countries into which we invested, including China. So over the time that I was there, we built a business in China of 10 billion US dollars, starting from 100 million in about 2003. So there were things that we found to do in China. As I said, there were sectors that we would like to enter, and some of those they've now found way in with joint venture with Land Rover, for example, into automotive. But it has to be a joint venture. You can't just invest 100% into a plant in China to make cars. But I think the key point is don't underestimate what Indian business can do. This is what sometimes foreigners used to come to Mr. Tata and say, please call the Prime Minister and tell him that his policy is nuts. And particularly this Prime Minister, for whom influence from industry is probably not as welcome as it has been in the past.
Thanks very much, Alan. Before I ask the next question from our audience, I want to bring in the poll question one more time. First two segments. I would like to run the poll question again and see how many have really changed their mind. The poll question is, economic relations between India and China will become worse due to COVID-19 pandemic? Yes or no? Please answer by clicking on the red and the green button available on Zoom rather than typing it on the chat window. Thank you. The next question that we have is for Mr. Zheng. It's from Mr. Zubin Sharma. And he wants some kind of an assessment between similarly situated countries in India, so India, Mexico, Vietnam, and who seems to be a good contender for pulling businesses that will be leaving China. Well, if businesses are in fact leaving China, which is not entirely certain.
Yeah. Well, this is actually one of the points I just intended to cover, but did not have time. Because I want to say that there's a misconception by some of the Indian friends, especially in the political world, saying that Indian market is indispensable to Chinese capital, Chinese investors. And then even if some of the barriers are set, Chinese are destined to come to India and make investment. But it is not the truth. So if you put yourself in a Chinese investor's shoes, you will see quite a lot of countries in your list. I would say 10 years ago, India was not at all on the top of the list. But after these 10 years, the ranking of Indian has come up a little bit, but still not the highest. Some of them looking at a huge market in future in the next 10, 15 years. So they want to do some preparation now. So I would say with this policy, more and more Chinese companies will come to think about, say, countries like Vietnam or Southeast Asian countries, or even, as you mentioned, in some of the Latin American countries, or even African countries as well. So one more point I want to say here is that a lot of discussion on this saying US companies moving out of China, some other countries moving their companies out of China. But if you look at China, the manufacturing or the supply chain is mainly composed of Chinese companies who are supplying their products to US companies in their brands. So if you look at the structure of the economy in China, there's no much of the so-called US companies in China. So in other words, there's no much of these US companies to move out of China. To move out of China, it will be again Chinese companies. They might be supplying to some other brands from some other countries, but it's not US companies at all. So I would say by doing this FDI policy, Indian is disadvantaging yourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Bin. I have a couple of questions for Mr. Harris Liu now. One is from Prashant Kaushik, who's a professor at Central University of Gujarat in India, and another one from Mr. Matt He. The questions, I want to rephrase them because they are broadly on the same issue. But what do you think is needed for the trust deficit between the two nations to go away so that a stronger economic partnership can be built? How do we manage the trust deficit? Is it at a firm level, at a government level, or there's something we are missing here?
I think the trade economic cooperation between China and India over the past, we can see over the past 10 years, really generate very good performance for both countries, because the investment from China really make contributions to the local economic and trade development. For example, according to the report from the Brookings Institution in March, Chinese firms existing and planned investment in India stand at more than $26 billion. Chinese automakers Great Wall, MG Motor have bet big on India, while its tech giants Tencent, Alibaba have fueled growth of Indian digital payment firms. Paytm grows a big basket and the ride-hailing giant Ola. While MG started selling cars in India last year, it is yet to fully invest $650 million it has committed to India. Great Wall is yet to start production in India, but said in February it plans to invest $1 billion in the coming year. In Noida, Chinese mobile phone companies have already employed 60,000 Indian workers, making positive contributions to the local social and economic development. As many as 100 mobile phone part suppliers plan to set up factories in Noida this year. Now they are concerned that the process could take several weeks or even months and hit deals and investment timelines. I think, so you see from the government level, since the government of India, I think make the facilitation measures to attract investment from China. Also, I have Mr. Mohan chairman of the Startup Indian Association, is of the opinion that the revised FDI may force these Chinese investors to postpone or even stop these funds from topping up their investments or respecting their great term sheets. The Union Council of India, which depend on their largest investors to keep the cash flowing, may now have to start looking for new anchor investors. Growth stage startups may also see investment drying up. So you see also Mr. Mahendra Swarab said that the pool of capital coming from US and Europe is drying up because their own economies are taking a beating. SoftBank Group from Japan also in a hard time. At such time, the government is turning off the tap from China, setting up barriers to Chinese investors who have the ability to invest, which is not conducive to the development of Indian startups. So you see, that's a point of view from the CEO from the India side. What am I thinking that for the time being, India is not start to resume economic activities and promote economic growth. China will play a part in helping India to Indian economy to develop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liu. I have to bring in Dr. Mohan Kumar here now, because what Mr. Harris just said, and before him, Mr. Zheng touched upon, ties up very well with two questions that we've got for Dr. Kumar. China can help India out in the post-pandemic phase in many different ways. Do you think there are any lessons we can learn from Chinese in order to bolster our efforts to attract more investments, given that how much they've done and how much progress they've made, especially in technology? And we already know how much they have supported the startup ecosystem, including in India. What are your thoughts?
So, Ashish, lest anybody misunderstands my position, I'm of the firm opinion that Chinese investment in certain sectors in India are extremely critical. And these have to do with infrastructure, they have to do with renewable energy, they have to do even with electric vehicles. I mean, I would be the first to say, open up these sectors without any check and balance to China, because they are leaders in these areas and India has to benefit from Chinese investment. I will argue that we should have a Chinese desk officer in every ministry for these sectors. Intimate these sectors to China and say, we're going to welcome you with open arms, really. So the answer to your first question is yes. What I am saying, however, is there are certain sectors where I think there is a sensitivity. I tried to be as frank as possible to you. Just as Chinese have some sensitivity in some sectors, we have to accept that. So I think there is no question that in many other sectors, we need Chinese investment. I'm firmly of the view that we should actually welcome it. For the sake of transparency, tell the Chinese that these are the sectors in which you don't have to consult the government. I think we need to do that, frankly. That's what I would do if I was a policymaker. Lessons from China. You know, I must thank Wen Juan, because she is the one who introduced me to China. She and her husband received me, and that, can you believe it, 36 years in the foreign service, I never went to China. I went to China, and thanks to Wen Juan, I was introduced to China. My two observations as to how lessons can be learned. China has a strong state, but more importantly, it has a very efficient state. Having worked for 36 years in the government of India, I have to honestly tell you, we do not have a similar state. Let's be honest, that is a big difference. The state in China is completely different, frankly. It's ruthlessly efficient. And the second point is the population in China has discipline and accepts what the government tells them to do. Now, you know the situation in India, and I'm going to stop there because frankly, you are comparing apples and oranges. It's a completely different political system. We have to accept that. So lessons for India will have to start with transfer of technology from China and specific investment from China in certain areas. If that can happen, I think the relationship can go to greater heights. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. I have a couple of questions, well, a lot of questions now for Tushar and Pratibha. Let me start with Tushar. Question from Matt Liu, who from Giant View, which is a mobile tech startup funded by Xiaomi. Two-part question. The first one is how many actual smartphone users actually pay digitally in India? I think I can respond to that. But the more important question, Tushar, is what kind of expectation do you have vis-a-vis consumer spending and its financing in the aftermath of COVID-19?
Okay, that's a great question, Ashish. So I'll answer this question in two parts. As a business, what we are seeing is that the demand is certainly slipping. On the other hand, we are also seeing that the demand for people who are not in a target audience, that is rising exponentially. So we used to get about 1 million or 2 million applications in a month. That has now gone to about 10 million in the last 2 months. So not all of it is gloomy, but that also means that not all of it is going to be good for business, because we don't see a lot of the folks who are reaching out to us for funds to be part of our target audience. Our belief is that demand will slip for the next couple of months, but based on what we have seen happen in other geographies, mainly China, how Europe is recovering and how the US is recovering, it'll likely be 3 to 4 months in the most optimistic sense for demand to reach the pre-COVID levels. We, as most of the firms, are being very cautious, partly because a lot of our risk models were built pre-COVID. And we believe that post-COVID, a lot of these risk models will have to be rejiggered to especially find out what segments of the economy are going to be in a position to pay back loans, etc. As some people have also mentioned in this conversation, used to be very simple to perhaps lend money in India, which was you described, how well people educated, which companies they work for, and it was the case that largely large MNCs or companies which had investments were paying money to this, employees on time. However, post-COVID, we don't think that's going to be the case. So the likes of Swiggy, Zomato, it's public news, they're struggling, but they're also very strong companies like airlines and companies in the manufacturing sector which are struggling. So it's anybody's guess on what the impact will be. Therefore, we have chosen to be cautious, but we also think the demand at the same time has also plateaued, and it'll take probably a couple of months for it to come back online.
Thank you, Tushar. And to quickly respond to the other question about number of smartphone users, let me inform particularly our audience who are joining from outside the country. India has over 1 billion mobile subscriptions. Out of this, roughly 500 to 550 million are smartphone users. And the user base for digital transactions in India, and Tushar, please correct me if I'm wrong here, was around 150 million by end of 2019, last year. It was expected to increase to about 300 million by the end of this year, but I guess everything is going to change because of COVID.
Yeah, look, I'll quickly jump over here. So that really is perhaps the paradoxical piece in India. So although India represents, like I mentioned, 1/3 of the humanity, has 1 billion people, about 980 million active mobile phone connections. In reality, if you were to kind of piece together and there's about 300 million users which Paytm had at one point in time, the number of unique individuals who are transacting on e-commerce or other platforms which you may be familiar with are actually close to about 60 million. Mm-hmm. So what has happened is that in the last decade or so, that number just hasn't grown. Even though there's been $1 billion investments coming in the likes of Flipkart, a bunch of other e-commerce companies, that base unfortunately has been stagnant. So what that tells you is that there is a very small sliver of the population, which is really out of the 1% and 2%, which are really benefiting from the spend in e-commerce or online technologies, and the rest of the country is being ignored. And therefore, it's an important opportunity for entrepreneurs and for business people and investors to recognize that there is, despite the headline news of certain sectors of the economy being taken over by Chinese companies or Indian companies, there is a very, very wide market of India which is still open, which is almost 1 billion people. So this is a very, very small sliver of base. So Western or perhaps Chinese or other models which have worked well in the West do not work well in India. So there is a real compelling opportunity for homegrown entrepreneurs to build business models which are relevant for India, and for which they likely will require investment, whether it's Chinese or overseas, because India, as some professors have pointed out as well, just doesn't have the capital or the money to fund these investments, be it in e-commerce, be it in technology, or be it in infrastructure.
Thank you, Tushar. So India needs investments. There is a considerable appetite. There's a large untapped market for investments. So with that, I want to turn to Pratibha. There are a number of questions, Pratibha. Let me start with a broad one first. After the press note, detailed FEMA guidelines are of course awaited. Now, this covers FDI, not FPI. Foreign portfolio investment is not covered at the moment. But logically, if FDI has been brought into the ambit, FPI is also going to be dealt with in possibly the same way. Now, in due course of time, we'll hear, as you said, we'll hear something from SEBI, RBI. SEBI, for our viewers, is the Securities and Exchange Board of India, and RBI is the central bank. Pratibha, the question is, do you think Government of India's key concern at the moment could be valuation at which investments are coming in?
Thanks, Ashish. Can I just, before I go into the technical question, just respond to some of the comments that were made?
Yes, please.
It really saddened me to hear that, we want transfer of technology from China. Ideally, we should have developed our economy to that level. India and China were not that far off, a couple of decades ago. And to be in a state where we are saying we want technology transfer from China really, really saddens me. I think, our bureaucracy, unfortunately, and, since we are being frank, and Dr. Mohan Kumar asked us to be frank, we've really shot ourselves in the foot by our policies. Lessons to be learned from China is simple. You need economic growth. You need to pull your people out of poverty. You need to be at a stage where the world will take you seriously. And unless, we have that level of economic growth, issues such as your Indian startup who will take that data available in India, use the technology to mine it for the benefit of Indians, to provide loans to people in the middle and lower income segment. What are we doing? We are tying their hands with regulations that are overarching and lack of capital availability in the country. I've been on these panel discussions, where some of these extreme nationalists say, why do they take money from these, and they don't just restrict it to Chinese? Why do we take it from the Americans and the Chinese? Why can't they take money from the domestic investors? Where are the domestic investors? The banks are not lending. The pension funds in India don't invest in private investments. Where is that capital going to come for growth of Indian startups? How is Indian industry to grow to an extent that we don't ask for China for technology transfer? We are very much capable of doing it ourselves if we are just not embroiled in the nationalism debate without understanding the needs. I just read a Scotiabank report. It's just breaking news from them right now. In the SME sector, we are going to lose 5 to 6 crore jobs. So it really, we can talk about, already we had sectors that were prohibited sectors, including defense. You could expand that list instead of coming with a broad press note that says, every investment now has to go through an approval route. So sorry, I just had to put it out there. In terms of, what the government is worried about, the rhetoric is yes, that it's valuation, Indian companies being taken over at low valuations. But to that extent, again, FEMA is not the right law to provide those restrictions, or at least, the beneficial ownership definition and putting a restriction on any ownership at all from Chinese investors coming into India. You could tweak the valuation guidelines to that effect. Even FPI, as you mentioned, Ashish, FPI investment is less than 10% of any company is supposed to be an FPI investment. Anything above and over 10% is supposed to be FDI investment. So, depending on what the aim of the government is, if it is that they will not allow any financial investment into the country, then you should restrict FPI. Otherwise, there's no need to restrict FPI because FPI does not lead to control.
Thank you, Pratibha. I will get some, I'll try to get some reactions on the initial remarks that you gave. It was very interesting. But I want to share some more technical questions with you that have come in. One is from Benjuan, so it's impossible to evade that. One is from Gaia Guan, Shanghai-based Mocha tech company. And Gaia's question is, would the FDI press note and its implementation affect Chinese companies who intend to register a local Indian subsidiary this year?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Ashish?
Would the press note and its effective implementation affect Chinese companies who intend to register a local Indian subsidiary this year?
No, absolutely. That's the prime target for the Press Note 3. So if you've already set up a subsidiary, any additional investments into that entity would require you to go and get approval. Doesn't mean you won't get approval. It's just that you will have to go through the process. And if you're setting up a subsidiary, and even if you're setting up through a Singapore or a Mauritius or some intermediary route from another country, it would still, if the beneficial ownership is still in Chinese hands or Hong Kong, you will still need to go for approval.
Okay, there's another one for you, Pratibha. Has any, and this is from Benjuan, two-part question, has any expedited process been specified for greenfield investment? Do you see that on the horizon? That's part A. Part B is, what about automatic FDI in Indian companies coming from other countries, Singapore, Mauritius, or other parts of Asia?
So the second question I just answered, which is even if it is coming from any other part of the world, if the beneficial ownership, and it's not defined, but the AD bankers who implement the RBI FEMA guidelines, they've interpreted it either 15% or 25% beneficial ownership. So if there is 15 or 25%, up to 25% beneficial ownership in any investor investing into an Indian company is in Chinese hands, then you will need to go for approval, irrespective of which jurisdiction you're coming from. With respect to greenfield investments, it's a very good question. Again, it's a sector that India keeps saying that it's important that we are setting up factories. We have said we are investing in infrastructure. All of that should be welcome. And in fact, we recently were advising a client on going to SEBI and asking for creating a specific window for those investments. But nothing as of today that we are aware of.
All right. Unfortunately, nothing as of today. I have another. I quickly want to share, because we have a lot of participants from China. Well, there has been no official word from the Commerce Ministry or the External Affairs Ministry on Chinese investments in greenfield projects. The CEO of Niti Aayog, which is the policy think tank of the government of India, the CEO is Mr. Amitabh Kant. He said something very interesting last month in a televised interview on CNBC. He said, and I quote, "India still welcomes investment from everywhere, including China. We realize that India needs equity and FDI. If China comes in with greenfield investment, we would welcome that. All Chinese companies manufacturing in India should continue to do so." So that's something I wanted to add, quoted by Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO of Niti Aayog. Now I want to very quickly, we still have about 10 minutes left. I want to come back, I want to get some reactions on what Pratibha said. Pratibha is saddened by the fact that we need to think about tech transfer from China and due to, and some kind of continued absence of domestic investments. And I'd like some reactions on that. Alan, how would you help me ensure that Pratibha doesn't leave sad after this discussion?
Well, Ashish, I think she is right to be sad. A few years ago, I wrote a book on entrepreneurship in India based on 109 interviews with Indian entrepreneurs. And I had a couple of critical conclusions and concerns, partly about government policy, partly about the behavior of VCs. But the biggest failure of Indian business, and this is not just entrepreneurs, frankly, it's also Tatas and large companies, is the lack of innovation. And if you close markets and if you make the incumbents powerful, you won't get innovation. One of the key differences between the Indian entrepreneurship scene and that in the US or even in China is the lack of connection between entrepreneurs, VCs, and universities and science spaces. So India, I think, has got some amazingly powerful and prominent researchers, but they are not connected to industry and job creation in the way that their equivalents in the US or China would be. So to come to, I mean, I think that the point that Pratibha raises is a really good one. How do we get technology innovation and business model innovation into Indian business? One of the key things is around the science base, and that comes back to government policy around science and scientific research.
Thank you, Alan. Any other reactions on this?
So Ashish, if I may.
Yes, please.
No, I think one of the sad things, it's very hard to disagree with Pratibha. She's spot on. So there's no issue there. Just as you ask a private sector person and he will have a very dim view of Indian bureaucracy, the sentiment is exactly mutual from the other way around. Let me assure you. We also think the Indian private sector often loots and scoots and doesn't innovate and doesn't have staying power. So that is one of the tragedies. By the way, both sides probably are wrong and we exaggerate a little, but there is some truth to both sides' view also. A very dim view of the Indian private sector, frankly, because as she rightly says, 70 years after, we are still, I mean, everybody knows. I remember in 1975 from my school in Kendriya Vidyalaya, somebody was to go to China. I was chosen as a good student to go, and I was shattered when I wasn't able to go. But my teacher came back and said, listen, there is nothing to choose between India and China. It's a poor country like India. You haven't missed much. This was 1975. Look where China is now. So let's be honest that there is a certain ecosystem which promotes technology transfer. There has been an element of coercion in the Chinese system to technology transfer. This has also got to be accepted. It is not as if the Chinese state made a laissez-faire thing that each one can do what they want. India is too much of a laissez-faire. So there is something to be learned from their system as well, that if there is an FDI that comes in, we must also try to transfer technology or acquire technology. So there has been a failure on multiple fronts, but it's, as Alan and Pratibha have said, it's very hard to disagree with the proposition that we should now not be thinking of technology transfer, but I suppose better late than never. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Tushar, I really want a quick reaction from you. It's I was interested in understanding how to understand the trust deficit between India and China overall, but it seems we have gravitated towards a possible trust deficit between the private sector and the government. Now, if there is a lack of innovation, how do we push our frontier technologies, fintech, for example, forward? What is it that would help?
Look, so I won't be qualified to necessarily remark on the challenges or the opportunities of private sector and collaboration with the government. I think it's a topic left for another discussion. But in purpose of our sector, which is an NBFC regulated sector, I think frequent rule changing certainly is not good. The regulated entities, like as you may remember or know, is required future planning. So whenever capital inflows get impacted, the next question would be, some other country may think, well, am I next in the list? So I think that is probably one thing which the government should not do. But I think there are also opportunities for collaboration. So I think, as Professor Kumar mentioned, India is one of the few countries in the world which has a lot of data, but that data is not democratized. If I were to go apply for a loan or apply for a bank account, I'll have to submit the same information to the passport office, to the office to get a gas connection, to get a mobile connection. Is there a way for us to get all the data democratized so companies can take advantage of that? There are avenues like digital locker, etc., which the government is popular, but they haven't really been put to use. Similarly, India has a very vibrant mobile ecosystem, yet you still cannot use your mobile to pay for a train ticket, for example. You can pay for e-commerce, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a very small sliver of the population, probably the 1%, which can take advantage of that. GST returns are not public, custom returns are not public, import-export data is not public, at least at the invoice level. A lot of it can be made public with the consent of the users, of course, and that can open opportunities for fintech as well as other sectors to take advantage of. And currently, it is these advancements in regulation, in the rule of law, criminal law, other procedural law, is where other countries have taken huge steps as compared to India. And I think I know we're digressing the topic, I think if we were to do that in India, apart from also not changing regulation too frequently for investments, I think that perhaps will be a big catalyst, at least the industry which I represent, which is financial technology.
Thank you, Tushar. So thanks very much for all those comments and insights. I have the results of the audience poll that has just come in. The question was, economic relations between India and China will become worse due to COVID. As a professor, let me tell you how all of you have performed in the test of convincing our audience. The 90% of the audience felt that the relations, economic relations will get worse. And after hearing all of you, now 95% feel that the economic relations will become worse. So yes, Mr. Zheng.
Sorry, I just want to make one more comment. So
Please.
Because it's quite a lot of discussion in the chat part. So I want to clarify one thing, as mentioned by Dr. Kumar, about Google, Twitter, about Amazon. I want to clarify one thing, that when you read the news in Western medias, please be reminded what is the fact behind that. Google was in China and they choose to exit Chinese market because they violated Chinese law and did not want to rectify. Amazon was in China operating for many years and decided to exit Chinese market because they believe they cannot compete with Alibaba in Chinese market, and they want to go to other markets like India. They can have a high margin. Twitter, I think, is by the same logic. So don't say that Chinese don't want to Google. I think it's practically okay if Indian want to set some law saying that if you violate this law, you are not welcome in India. It will be perfectly fine to any Chinese company. But rather than combined with the NITI IOC you mentioned, while welcoming Chinese companies, don't say that Chinese companies, or put it in another vague word, saying neighboring countries are not somehow welcome. You're welcomed. If you don't comply with our laws, certainly you will be kicked out. It will be perfectly fine. So that might be somehow encouraging to Chinese companies, saying that, well, we are somehow still welcomed in India. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those comments. I have I really want to push this discussion by 5 more minutes, if that's okay with everyone. So I have a last question for each panelist. And this is a question simply because you've pushed an additional 5% to say yes to that question. And the question for each panelist, and I'll tell you what it is, has a context. There's a very famous economist, Carmen Reinhardt, a professor of international finance at Harvard Kennedy School, who also serves on the advisory boards of IMF and the New York Federal Reserve. And from next month, she's going to be the chief economist of World Bank. She said something very interesting last week, and the remarks were endorsed by the World Bank officially. She said, without being melodramatic, the 2008 global crisis gave globalization a big hit, as did Brexit, as did the US-China trade war. But COVID-19 is the last nail in the coffin of globalization. So I'd like a 30-second response from each panelist on this question. Dr. Kumar, has COVID-19 killed globalization?
So, Ashish, I think there is no question that there are going to be significant changes. I don't go as far as to say that we should divide history between BC and AC, that is before Corona and after Corona. I wouldn't go as far as that. I think the Corona crisis is accelerating trends. The trends were already evident before Corona, but those trends are going to be magnified in a very, very significant way. So I fundamentally agree with the proposition that there are going to be very significant changes in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harris Liu, has COVID-19 killed globalization?
If I'm
Short
of the opinion, COVID in this year really have a negative effect for globalization and free trade. But for long run, cooperation and development are the mainstream for countries in the world. India needs to develop, needs to improve its living standards of its people, and China will play a part in this development. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Pratibha, if I can ask, if I edit the question slightly in line with what Prime Minister Modi said, do we need a completely new template for globalization now?
According to me, Ashish, the pandemic is just a ruse for local politics. I think this was an ongoing trend. And the pandemic is just an excuse by the politicians to further that agenda. Is it desirable? Absolutely not. I think, having seen the benefits, having lived through 80s and then 90s and 2000s in India, I prefer global markets which promote innovation than local politics. Thank
you, Pratibha. Mr. Zheng, do you think globalization is dead and we need a new template?
I'm not saying that we go so far to say the globalization is dead or it's dying, but there definitely will be a lot of changes, as mentioned by the panelists. In my view, there will be more regional cooperation, like the RCEP. The question left to India is whether India want to be this part or on the other part, or by itself forming another part.
Thank you. Alan, your take on the question.
Absolutely not. I'm sad for politicians that you can't control long-term trends such as technology, climate change, and the movement of viruses. I'm reminded really of two political leaders, one effective and one not. The ineffective one was a very early king in England called King Canute, who was told he was so powerful he could stop the tide coming in. So he was put in a chair on the beach and he said to the sea, "Do not come in." And he got his feet very wet. So you can't stop the forces. The second thing I would say is remember what Deng Xiaoping said. He said it does not matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So frankly, the nature of capital is anonymous as long as it produces job creating and wealth creating investment.
Thank you, Alan. Tushar, what's your take on the question, has COVID killed globalization?
I think nationalism, patriotism, protectionism will continue. However, I don't think, as Alan mentioned, globalization will stop. The trends behind globalization were not political. It was demographic. The changes are far too big for any politician or one country to stop. 48% of the US will be Black and Hispanic. 700 million Indians will demand better services. And it will not be for any government to be able to stop that. So I don't think Corona would stop globalization.
Thank you, Tushar. So I've just realized that we had a lot of comments coming in the chat window and questions, which we obviously we can't take up anymore. But Venjuan and I will work on preparing a short summary of this. Maybe we collate all the comments and questions and we'll share it with the speakers and the participants. Now, while I'm unhappy that more people feel that the India-China economic relations are going to go worse, I have something positive to share, that the two countries are celebrating 70 years of diplomatic relations. And they should keep in mind that, everyone should keep in mind, that the world needs China. And there's no future of the world without India. The rise of the two nations, both economically and financially, as was mentioned in the concept note, may not be a zero-sum game for the world. that needs to rebuild a lot more now, given what COVID has done. Now, earlier this month, Prime Minister Modi said, vocal for local, not only to buy local products, but also to promote them proudly. Now, this reminded me of what economist Paul Krugman, and it links with what Alan earlier said. What Krugman said, that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. Market competition induces a non-stop search for higher productivity that boosts not only growth, which some of the speakers really want to see, but it also promotes prosperity of people and citizens. Now, this means specializing in and exporting what you can do best, which is what Dr. Kumar said, while importing the rest. And that includes all kinds of financial capital after a check and balances. Now, if instead you aim for self-sufficiency, regardless of competitiveness, your productivity is likely to fall behind others who globalize. This is at least what economic theory tells us. And this is the classic story of Jawaharlal Nehru, former Prime Minister of India, versus Lee Kuan Yew that we all know of. The fourth phase of the lockdown in India ends tomorrow. Let's see what Prime Minister Modi has to say. But I have to thank all our panelists for joining, for their time. This is a particularly hectic time for everyone. So thank you very much for participating. And I thank all our audience for their patience and time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you. Bye-bye.